going to be something ridiculous. This
Right. Hi, David. How are you?
Got it. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Very good.
Don't worry, everyone who's watching. I wasn't extending my face at you. I was looking at my computer.
Okay.
You're welcome.
So, David, I'm going to ask you a few questions for my class. If you
All
don't
right.
mind.
Sounds terrifying. Let's go.
Okay. So, I know that you are training in martial arts, specifically Kung Fu, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Could you first explain what that is, Kung Fu, a little bit, what that is, for those who don't know?
Sure. I mean, who doesn't though? Who hasn't seen movies?
Some people.
Kung Fu. That's funny. I make fun of them now. Kung Fu is a traditional martial arts. Kung Fu means hard work, but martial system is known as Wushu, which is literally translated as martial arts. And it's learning how to fight people, trying to stop bad guys. Presumably, though, you're not there just to be malevolent, and you're there to learn some sort of moral virtues, which we have codified in what we call the Wu Dai, or the martial code. And so you get to kind of test yourself by putting yourself under pressure to see if you can uphold those standards, which is kind of nice. And then you can try to live those things in the rest of your life, which is also quite nice. So self-defense, beating people up, becoming a better person, all of that good stuff rolled into one.
Can I ask
Now, whether
you,
I typify any of those, probably not. But here we are.
can I ask you why you decided to train to learn Kung Fu?
Why I started doing Kung Fu? That's because I saw Simon doing sword form. I wanted to do martial arts for about as long as I can remember. So I was the nerdy kid in school who would go like look at a book of martial arts and be like, that sounds cool. And so eventually ended up doing Krav Maga for a little bit. I got through like the first level. I was going to go to level 2, and then transitioned over to Kali and Wing Chun for a second. And then I finally saw the Kung Fu people and eventually tried it out. I'd been into working out and trying to do intense training, as intense as I could. And eventually I think I got thrown into a full body day at some point and was like just sitting with, like, we used to have a throw up bucket. And I was just sitting there like, oh, it's so bad. And I was like, yeah, this is the right place. So we'll, continue on here. So yeah.
So you basically try different other martial arts, and then you, I guess you thought Kung Fu was the right thing for you. Was it something? What was about it that, other than the throwing up?
A number of things, number of features. So I think one, Kung Fu is, oh, why is my computer trying to stop me from speaking? Kung Fu does a really good job of implementing multiple ideas into one system, right? So they call it the mother of martial arts, not because, everything necessarily derives from it, because you could go back a little bit further and say there's, Mongolian wrestling and Indian stuff. But the idea is that because it has everything kind of in its system already, you can focus on different elements. So it has throws, it has locks, it has punching, kicking, all that kind of stuff, falling down, doing parkour. So I think that was a big element, is like, oh, it already has everything built in. So I don't have to go try to figure out how to do all this other cool stuff that I always wanted to do, which is kind of nice. And you've seen my personality report, which is terrifying, but I'm, kind of hard to nail down. So I enjoy doing lots of fairly diverse things. And so it already had a bunch of diverse things in one place for me to do. The intensity was high, which was nice as well. I like to try to push myself if I can. Doesn't look like it, but I do. Yeah, so that was also nice. And then everyone, like, the fighting was also refreshing because, we haven't done quite as much fighting right now because of the whole COVID silliness. But when I walked in, right, I finally saw them sparring, and it was just dudes and chicks beating the nonsense out of them, no pads, just bare knuckles, locking each other, poking each other in the eyes and stuff. And, you're like, is that allowed? And I'm like, of course, would someone not do that to you out in the world? And you're like, yeah, you got a point. And that's not something that the other groups and systems were necessarily doing. There was also kind of the culture of it, right? You've hung out with everybody and you know how nice it is. And there's not a lot of barriers to it, as opposed to the other systems where it's like you got your two lessons a week where you got to do, you line up, you bow, you do exactly what's defined, and that's it. And so you don't get a lot of personal time either with the instructor or, to really move forward. And they put time limits on things. So it's like, again, back to my personality thing, industriousness. I like to try to reach goals. I'm very goal oriented. And so that's a really nice part of Kung Fu is there's just a list of things that you can do on your own time. And if you want to do it really quickly, or well, as quickly as you can, I should say, then you can do that. The other places don't, right? They put a time limit on it. You have to be in this level for this many years or whatever. So it doesn't matter if you do really well, you still have to wait. And that was annoying for me. So I guess I'm just impatient is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, all of that stuff kind of rolled into one. And there's swords, man. Why wouldn't you enjoy that?
In my class, we talk about culture a lot. And I'm going to give you a definition.
Something I don't have.
Well, I'll give you a definition and you can rethink what, there's one way of defining culture. And I'm quoting, the total pattern of a group's customs, beliefs, art, and technology. In other words, a culture is a common way of life and it's passed on from one generation to another. So would you say that Kung Fu has its own culture?
Yeah, I'd absolutely say that. It's interesting because we've actually gone into discussions about that kind of within the group, because this particular school does things different than a lot of other traditional Kung Fu schools where you would normally go in and you'd bow and they'd have a whole shrine and stuff to like old instructors and whatnot. And of course, we don't ever do that and we're just poking fun at each other all the time. So yeah, there's definitely, I would say a pretty well-defined culture and a hierarchical structure that you can see and interact with and still not be intimidated by, which is also kind of nice, if that makes any sense.
So then, do you think that the culture that you're experiencing at the gym is influencing your lifestyle or the way you live every day?
It has, and I'd say it still does. I'd say there's an interesting disconnect though, simply because there's a point where to reach certain levels of skill, not to say that I'm that good or anything, but to try and continue, one of the things you have to learn is for all martial arts, I would say, and again, probably people who are going to disagree with me, it's self-motivated and self-driven. So you can interact with people when you fight and when you do stuff, but at some point you have to sit and learn techniques and you spend hours doing stuff, training pretty much by yourself. So even though you're in this culture and this environment, there are times where you almost have to disconnect from what people are doing and telling you to do so you can focus on training. So there's a weird disconnect where yes, it is very influential, but there's also, it's odd. It helps build you up and build up your own, I hesitate to say self-esteem because it makes me think of like a bunch of self-help books. But it's basically that, you grow your self-confidence and your ability to understand how the martial art works. And so then you can derive your own method of training. And at some point you have to kind of back up a little bit and go, okay, what am I focusing on? And let me do that, right? And so you can see that happen, if anyone were to visit, you'd see that happen with people to varying degrees. And so you see them train as a group, maybe do the warm up or whatever it is, and they go off and train, and then they come back and we have, our little powwow and we hang out and we do whatever. But if you're actually trying to move, you're kind of pushing away from the group and then coming back, which I think is influenced from the system itself. So would I say it's influencing you? Yes, but I would also say it builds a self-reliance, which almost pushes you away from it in a weird way. So I don't know. Maybe that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah. Do you think it? So you mentioned self-esteem, and I want to ask if you think. Do you think it influences it? It helps with the self-esteem.
I think it can. Yeah.
Do you know? Well, do you know? I guess I would first ask the definition of self-esteem, or how would you define it?
That's an excellent question. Let's see. If I were to define self-esteem, I would probably think of two subcategories. So having like an appropriate self-image, and then having a way to self-motivate, because you can motivate yourself to do something that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
We would just say that positive self-evaluation is what it is. The motivation,
yeah,
I guess,
that makes good
can
sense.
follow. So you think it does influence, it helps with self-esteem?
I think it can. I think it can. I think martial arts as a whole, I think lots of things as a whole, but martial arts in particular are, and we've kind of discussed this in class, is really a crucible to see what you're doing in a way that's effective enough to sustain itself under pressure or under pain or whatever. So I would say the cultural elements can help you more with the self-esteem than anything, just because we hang out, we build each other up, we'll tell you can get from A to B, you can pass these levels or these tests. But the actual training and whatnot, that can effectively break people down. This is why you see people not come back, right? Mm-hmm. You're in pain, you're going, I'm tired and I got 100 extra kicks to do, and then I'm going to get beat up with the kick I just learned. You're like, why did I bother? So it's this kind of like, did it effectively build me up or not? And then I think over time that snowballs, where you go, oh, okay, it worked, I got here, okay, I can continue and it'll work again. Mm-hmm. And then that will build. But I don't think it by necessity will build people's self-esteem. I think there's other components involved.
Do you think it influences the way you see gender roles, I guess? Masculinity, femininity?
Yeah, I was almost going to say no, and then I thought about how many times I've been beat up by women. I was like, you know what? Absolutely, yes, it does. Yeah. So I think yes, it's a weird thing. Yes and no, because I think my view of gender roles is pretty conservative, and it remains that way. But I have no misconception that women can beat the crap out of me or kill me.
What do you call conservative view of gender roles? What are your views?
Well, I guess a better question would be for me to ask you, what do you mean by gender roles, so I don't misstep and then go off onto some magical tangent somewhere.
What is the role that a woman and a man should play in the society? What is their place in the society and the qualities that they should possess?
Okay. So I'll kind of, it's funny, I was thinking about this the other day. I'm going to kind of default back to, everyone's going to hate this, but this is what's going to happen. Default back to 19th century, early 20th century view of those gender roles, which was effectively men and women were in two different spheres to affect one same goal, right? So marriage was a nuclear family was a predominant viewpoint, but the idea was that the woman had the more noble job and the more noble outlook on life, right? Which you see reflected in movies of the period and stuff, right? Women are very prim and proper and taken care of by men, and men had the kind of dirtier jobs of the world, which included things like politics, where you have to fight and argue with people, and business, where you have to fight and argue with people and potentially screw people over, and you have to deal with, moral uglinesses. And the woman dealt with, you're raising children, which is considered a more noble job, because you're making good people is the goal, right? You're making the next generation of good men and good women. So yeah, and of course the idea was like, well, yeah, we can't trust men to handle that because they're idiots. So it's like, yeah. So I would say that's it's closer to that, but I think there's a common misconception that women were always viewed as weak or not as valuable, which I don't think is correct. It's like turn of the century, or excuse me, turn of we'll say like 1st century AD, right? As 1st to 3rd century, there is the view that women and children were absolutely secondhand and they're effectively property, and that basically chattel marriages and stuff that Romans were doing and abusing children, and right, you could leave people out and leave children out to expose them, up to age 12. By that 100, 300 time period, that was going away, and women were viewed as equal. But they're viewed for their strength.
In different societies, it depends on the society you're talking about, right?
Yeah, I'm talking generally that Roman society that became Christianized, right? And so we kind of retain those views over time, more or less, right? We're kind of changing that now, and there's a more postmodern push, I'd say. But I think the mistake was the idea that we're viewing women as somehow inherently weaker intellectually or weaker morally or in value, which I don't think is correct. So that's, and I think the Kung Fu, to bring that back full circle, is, Kung Fu is nice because you focus on technique. So the technique should overcome deficiencies in strength, right? Ceteris paribus, potentially a woman would lose to a man because if they have, the same level of training and then he has more strength, then potentially there's something there. But the goal is that, if you're smaller in size or strength or whatever, your knowledge base overcomes whatever potential benefit they have in strength. And then, of course, there's the reality that there's pros and cons for every physical or anatomical thing that someone has, right? Height isn't always a beneficial thing, right? Because you get punched in the knees. Being super strong isn't always great because, you muscle bound idiot and you can't move. So at that point, these techniques cater to someone who is practicing, has a knowledge base, and understands what is effectual for their body type. And then I end up in a fight with some lady and she beats the crap out of me, and you're like, yeah, okay. So it's not.
So did it change?
It's an interesting thing.
Did your view of I guess gender roles have changed, or is it more of a good complement to what you already knew or kind of felt?
I feel like it's more of a compliment. It's just like, yeah, you can absolutely handle these things. And then it's if anything, it's helped me because it's like, well, okay, if we're both trying to affect some cause, we can back each other up in this together because we both have the ability to handle this, right? And I think, you're the one who knows all the studies, men and women are really similar most of the times, except for out at the extremes, from my understanding. So it's like, yeah, I think what it has done is just made it seem like, okay, we can really work together really well because we can at least, we can find how we complement each other, but it's still a complementarian view of gender roles as opposed to an egalitarian one. So if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And yes, I ramble. Sorry, people.
that was interesting.
You can always fast forward.